Jay McInerney.
Well, I'm going to start with my crime thriller, because I actually am not really a reader of crime fiction and suspense novels. But I think for Christmas, my friend Morgan Entrekin, who's the publisher of Grove Atlantic, gave me this Len Deighton novel called Berlin Game. And of course, I'd heard of Len Deighton. He's one of the most successful novelists of all time. But I'd never read one. And I just found myself somewhere where that was the book I had in my hand. And once I started it, I couldn't put it down, as we often say, of very suspenseful books. But I was so impressed with the writing, because the one writer whose suspense writing I have read is John le Carré, and this struck me as every bit as good as le Carré's better work. And I mean the granularity of the observation and the writing. I mean, the plot is very compelling, but the way that scenes are set, characters are drawn, even the dialogue, it was so impressive to a novelist such as myself, and I couldn't, I couldn't turn away. And it's a very intricate plot, which involves, of course, a spy, and he's somewhat in the mold of fictional spies, in that he's a little cynical, he's a little down at the heels. His career is kind of on the skids, whereas his wife is on the way up in the same agency. And basically he is charged as a sort of last hurrah. He's charged with finding a mole in the agency, and it is indeed surprising. I think this answers all of your requirements for it.
So it's a who done it, meaning who's the mole.
But in the end, you say, "Oh, yeah, of course," but you don't say that in the beginning as to who the mole is, and it's real, and it's also it's also set in that I don't know, I don't want to say romantic, but that kind of storied period of espionage in Berlin, where all the major powers were
like early Cold War,
Cold War, where all the major powers were sort of fighting for turf and spying on each other, and really compelling. The good news is, if you really like Berlin Game, there's about 34 others, including 2 more in this trilogy. So I was really blown away, and as I say, I feel like now I'm going to start reading more of these types of books, but particularly with Len Deighton. Let's see, my next novel is A Fan's Notes by Frederick Exley. Quite a different genre, if indeed it's any genre at all. It's very curious. The author himself, Frederick Exley, couldn't decide whether it was a memoir or a novel. He went back and forth in describing it, but it is clearly highly autobiographical, and it was published in '68, at which point he was 40 years old, and it's very interesting. It is a successful novel about a man realizing that he will never be a success, that he will never finish his novel, and that he's a miserable failure as a human being. The title refers to the fact that one of his few passions is Frank Gifford in the New York Giants. And every weekend he drives an hour from the town where he lives and teaches high school, in order to drink all day at a bar and watch the Giants play. He actually, just quite coincidentally, he went to USC at the same time that Frank Gifford was a student there and an athlete, and he becomes obsessed with Gifford. His own father was a student athlete in Watertown, New York, and he was locally famous. He was a big man around town, and Exley was obsessed with the idea of becoming famous, of somehow becoming like his father, Frank Gifford, and yet he he sabotages himself at every turn. For one thing, he's a stone cold alcoholic, and you'd think that would be very depressing, and at times I suppose it is. He also spends a fair amount of time in mental institutions, but
did you ever get to meet this guy?
I never did, unfortunately. I corresponded briefly with him before. I think he died in the early '80s, but he was. But I am not the only person who was just blown away by the honesty of the book. Also, he's a real stylist, and. But
it has shades of a million little pieces. You know that book that came out and it was about rehab and all those things. And I think he tried to sell it as a novel, and then that didn't work. Then he sold it as a memoir, and it did work. And then there was the whole Oprah exposure of which is which.
Yeah.
So did he sell it as a novel though?
Well, he was quite clear about the fact that it was a highly autobiographical document, and I think eventually it was published as a novel, but. But it's clearly very documentary.
Yeah.
And there's something strangely exhilarating about watching this guy trip over his own feet and sabotage himself at every turn. I suppose in part because it's so beautifully written, and I know I've sort of bonded with quite a few people over this book, including the man who became my editor, Gary Fisketjon. It's really extremely compelling. My last book is Light Years by James Salter, and James Salter is, I think, one of the great stylists of certainly my lifetime. But and he's a great novelist. But he was always called a writer's writer, and it used to drive him crazy. He said,
meaning I don't sell.
Well, yeah. I mean, he said, "How about I have your sales and we can call you a writer's writer." So, he was in the Air Force. He was a ski racer. He was a very interesting character. His books are highly literary, and his gifts as a stylist are just incredible. Nobody writes sentences like James Salter. Almost all the writers that I know revere him, and almost everybody else hasn't read him. I could have picked a number of his books, but for instance, A Sport and a Pastime, which is one of the most erotic books, literary books I've ever read, set in France in the 50s. Light Years is also set in the 50s, and I just love that. Although the couple in the book, Nedra and Veery, very strange names, but they live on the Hudson, and he kind of commutes in and out of New York as an architect. The book presents this idyllic marriage, at least from the outside, and they have dinner parties. They have these two lovely kids, and for whom they make toys and art and so on. And of course, eventually, it turns out they're both having affairs, and it's an extraordinary portrait of a marriage. But the marriage does fall apart in the end of the book. And the funny thing is, the first time I read it, I didn't remember that they got divorced because the portrait of the marriage was so good. But I think they present such a beautiful picture from the outside that the thought occurs to one that, they couldn't possibly be experiencing it that way on the inside. And it is okay if I just read a short passage.
Yeah, please.
I had to put this on my phone because I forgot the book today.
This is from the Salter book.
But this is from Light Years, and this is about Nedra, the wife. And this will give you a sense of the rhythms of his writing. During the days, she was utterly at peace. Her life was like a single well-spent hour. Its secret was its lack of remorse, of self-pity. She felt herself purified. The days were cut from a quarry that would never be emptied. Into it came books, errands, the seashore, occasional pieces of mail. She read them slowly and carefully, sitting in the sunshine, as if they were newspapers from abroad. I mean, I just find that amazing. I could almost pick any passage, and it would have the same strange rhythms, but also his sense, his sense of light, of the movement of air in a room is he writes about light like nobody I know. And
when did Salter pass away?
He died, I believe, in 2016.
Okay, so pretty recent.
He lived a long life, didn't he?
He lived a very long and productive life. He also wrote a couple of cookbooks, which I should mention. Len Deighton did too. And
You're a wine critic.
I'm a foodie.
Watches and cooking.
I'm a foodie. I was very fortunate that when I was writing the book you mentioned earlier, Brightness Falls, he lent me he used to go to Aspen in the winter to ski, and so he lent me his house in the Hamptons to work in the winter. And it's funny because Brightness Falls was actually, influenced by light years, certainly. And there I was in the place where it might have been created. But
well, that's it's a nice tribute to him. 9 years after his death, to have his fiction read here, and you three have written these iconic books. Decades from now, people begin reading you still. You've become immortal through your work.
If only. By the way, I would have mentioned The Wager, but I was concentrating on novels. A book I admire immensely and read fairly recently.
Oh, thank you. And there was a wonderful profile of Salter in the New Yorker about 5 years ago by Nick Palmegard.
Oh, that's right.
And to be honest, that is what prompted. I had never read Salter, the writer's writer, and went and devoured him as a result of that.
Oh, excellent! Yeah. No,
and he also enraptured by the prose. But I would never dare try to imitate it. I mean,
it's very hard. It's very hard to imitate. I mean, his sentences don't follow one another the way that most people's sentences do. I mean, most of us are like first A, then B, then C, and Salter is very sinuous and kind of oblique in his movements. And but I like Robert Stone. I hope that he gets that he continues to be read because.
It's funny how some
he was
do
always
and
a
some
little
don't.
bitter in his lifetime. That he
Was he a big seller in his lifetime?
No,
very small. I mean, not at all.
A cult writer.
Yeah, he was a cult writer, and all the right people liked him, but not enough of them.
I want to just add a couple things about A Fan's Notes, which I also really love. One is that it's hilarious. It's a very funny book. And I remember vividly a scene of the main character on a job interview, which is just, I mean, you said tripping over his own feet. I mean, you're sort of dying, and yet it's laugh out loud funny. And then the other thing that I find really poignant is that after the book came out, he and Frank Gifford became friends.
Yes. So
that kind of the idolization resulted in a friendship between two guys who were the same age, because as you say, they went to school together. I find that very sweet.
Yeah, he went on to publish 2 more books that were not as critically
fiction.
Again, kind of fictional memoir, and they were not as good as this. But a lot of people have one book in them, and he had this one book, and it was better than most books are.
Talented writer. Before we go to David, Jenny, you were before we got rolling, you were talking about a book recommendation you had made in the Times. Maybe you could retell maybe a little bit of that.
Yes. Well, the Times has this feature that they do of like books relating to a certain place, and they did one about New York City, and they asked me about a few different books, but the one or a few different kind of categories of New York, and one of them was sort of the publishing world. And I recommended Jay's book, Brightness Falls, which you just mentioned, as an example of a novel that I think best captures the publishing world as it was when I first began to publish in the mid 90s. And there's actually a line which I'm going to mangle if I try to quote it now, but it's
I
something
will
like
too.
There's a young guy who writes a book, and he becomes famous kind of overnight, and it says everyone listens a little bit more closely to everything he says, and he listens a little less closely to what everyone else says. And I just thought,
I think that's it.
I love it. It's so true. We all know that guy.